Thank you for this day, what you've given us, our college here. Just ask you to bless this class tonight in your name and just lead us through the scriptures. Lord, show us your way, your purpose for us in your name. Amen. Okay, so let's see. One thing I'm to announce that the Christmas banquet, tickets are on sale. It's 2 weeks from tomorrow. And tickets are still available for this great event that's happening on, December 1st. It's a Tuesday night, and the cost is only $30. The last day to get your tickets are Friday, November 20th. So get your tickets, come have great food, fun, and fellowship. Pastor Schaller will be speaking that night at that event. Okay. All right, so that's taken care of. Okay, so here we are we're still in the Middle Ages of history, and the church is pretty much dominated by the authorities in Rome. It's still the most powerful vehicle, Christian in a certain way, but really very unchristian in its practices. But the things that are happening. Now, we talked at the end of the last class about the Black Death. This is really a scene manifested itself again and again and again throughout the cities of Europe as this plague, bubonic plague, that was really spread because of the explosion in commerce. The explosion in world commerce brought covetousness to people's hearts. It destroyed an old system, the feudal system, which really tied people to land and by extension tied people to the Roman Church. But that feudal system fell apart as these trade routes developed. Now this is a town there. This is like a medieval town. Look at what a medieval town looks like. But these trade routes are very important. Now the Black Death swept through the cities of the Black Death swept through the cities of Europe because of these trade routes. The rats, Chinese rats, carrying the plague, were carrying the fleas that were carrying the plague. The fleas would come into the ports in Europe. You see Marseille, Lisbon, London. These places. London's not really a port. There's a river that goes up there, but you can see all the trade routes that were going through here, and so coming from China into Europe, bringing good things, bringing many things, but also bringing these rats with their fleas, and the fleas would hop on to people, bite people, and this black plague would strike them. They would become purple in color, and usually they died very quickly. So that we talked about last week in terms of how that crippled the population in Europe. 25 million people about that died from this plague. They didn't really understand the nature of the plague. They only knew that it wasn't affecting Jewish people because of their practice of hygiene and the kind of diets that they practiced, the kind of things that they were they allowed into their house. The idea of being kosher actually protected them from the plague. And that's really, we get a sense of what God was saying. Why did God give them these dietary rules, give them these cleanliness rules? It's we understand that the reason for it was to protect the people. The protection, those dietary rules aren't so religious in this context now. We see that really they are for the preservation of our health. So God knows His earth, His creation. He knows it. He understands it. And He developed these rules, these things that seem to be very legalistic, but in fact, they were for the protection of His people. So the trade routes did something. It created a new situation. It created towns, these kind of things, these small towns. Not maybe large cities, but you see that's a very cute kind of almost like Smurf land there. But it's like these are the kinds of towns that started to grow up throughout Europe, primarily because of this rise of a middle class. That's the thing that we're getting now. The Middle Ages saw, the first part of the Middle Ages, feudal system. The landowner was the king, and landowners ruled primarily. But when this practice of commerce, when there was commerce and trade, a new class of people, a middle class, began to emerge. Commerce, trade. You didn't have to have land. You just had to have a brain and integrity. And, these things developed throughout. So the new profession of merchant, traveling merchants who would sell their wares from town to town, bring them. These things would be shipped from the Orient, and then the traveling merchants would go from town to town, bringing their goods. We have our truckers today, trucking these things all over the United States, across the highways, and these were the precursors of these things. They were bringing, the trade to these towns. We see these towns. Some of these towns, they were walled cities. Some of them still exist here. We see this town, you can see very defined, the wall around it. And so people began to move into the cities. They began to move into the towns, and it gave them, a sense of belonging to something, a sense of community that maybe they were missing. That's the thing, what was it that Christ said? We can look at it maybe. Let's see. Where is it? Let's see. Is it in 15? Let's see. Abide in me, and I in you, and abide in the vine. I in the vine. This is John 15:5. I am the vine. You are the branches. He that abides in me, and I in him, the same shall bring forth much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. Verse 6. If a man does not abide in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them, cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me, verse 7, and my words abide in you, you shall ask what you will, and it shall be done unto you. And herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, so shall you be my disciples. As the Father has loved you, so have I loved you. Continue in my love. And if you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love, even as I kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. Therefore, this is my commandment, verse 12 of John 15, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. And so this is Jesus talking about this. This was really the church's failure. Cities. We know that cities are not new. Where's the first city? We can go back to Genesis chapter 4, I believe it is. And we see the nature of Cain. Cain, it says here, where is it? He's been driven. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, dwelt in the land of Nod and on the east of Eden. This is Genesis 4:16. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. So we know that cities, as a rule, did not have a really good beginning, but they are collections. They are collections of souls. And these souls, collections of souls, of people with eternal souls, and this is this development of cities again. This development of cities represents a failure of the church. The failure of the church to provide the community. So, there are small communities, but these people are basically looking for something to belong to. Poor people are not being cared for. They are being oppressed. The church is not speaking out. As a matter of fact, the church is one of its primary oppressors. And so people are giving themselves over to new things. And, failure of the church leads people, to look for some group to belong to, leads people to go, to find fellowship, to find community. I won't say fellowship. Fellowship is something that the Spirit brings, but community, can be, and it's different. It sounds like communion, but it's not. It's not really. It's just, you go to the, to the fields with your kids and watch your kids play sports and, that kind of thing. So the failure of the church to create like a passion in people's hearts, just by the general legalism that was there, the general formality, the general kind of, immorality also. Immorality was in the church. So you had that happening. The flesh was at work in the church that was going on. The three basic enemies of the Christian were at work in the Roman church. The flesh was really at work. The world had infiltrated men's flesh there, and the devil. And the devil was really happy to promote a system of religion that kept people in the dark about the Bible. Kept people in the dark about the Bible. So it's about the year 1000 now. And but all of what happened during God fits history together, and He ordains something for particular times. He holds the hearts of kings in His hand, and He turned the hearts of Charlemagne, Charles the Great in France, to organize schools. And the schools would be in different places. They would be based in the churches. These schools became universities, and these universities became the place of skepticism. Okay? This is like skepticism is it's a word, it's a strong word. It has those consonants in it that make it feel very aggressive, skepticism, but it really is, questioning. And questioning primarily the teaching that they had been received. The church was the basis for the schools, but now as people began to learn more and read more and see things. So, all right, around this time, from 1000 to 1300, there was battles. There was the battle over the Eastern Empire, battle over the Byzantine area of Europe. So let me get back to a picture here. Let's see. We have, a battle over this territory here. This is still the Byzantine area. We see this is another sort of trade route map. And, it gives us a good indication of where things were coming from. You see all the way over to India, down to what is now Indonesia, India, China, Korea. This is where goods are coming through in the kingdom of the great Khan, the Moguls, all these things. You could see that this is the way things were, the flow of things. The dark red line really shows like the flow of a primary, how the plague spread. The plague also was in these territories along these trade routes. So really the commerce and the covetousness in men's heart led to some of the spread of the plague. But these are the the primary things. But right in this Byzantine area, is under attack from the Muslims again, and the Crusades are going on. But the Muslims are seeking to take Constantinople, which is right here now, Istanbul, and so this starts something. This Byzantine Empire, a battle over that area, battle over Asia. Let's say Asia Minor, battle over Asia Minor by the Muslims. They want to take it over. And it does something significant for us as people of God. It does something. Okay, now remember, the Byzantine area, the Byzantine church, the Eastern church, it split from the Roman church. It did not want to have this Roman church. So their priests were still marrying, and they were also... They were protective. They protected the Greek classics. So Greek texts, ancient Greek texts, were still these ancient Greek texts were preserved, and the New Testament was one of those things. Greek New Testament, and also the writings, the philosophical writings of Aristotle, and those they were protected in this Eastern era. So classic literature, Homer, the blind poet, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Greek mythology, they receive Aristotle, the philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, all of this came west. It came west. It had been preserved, in these churches, in these church buildings in the Byzantine era, in the area over here, in this area. As these people moved west from the east to escape the invasion of Islam and to escape, the ravages of the plague, they brought the transcripts with them. They brought the ancient manuscripts with them, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, these things, and the New Testament. We know the New Testament is the most precious thing that came. But in these schools, in the schools that began to develop, universities became, we talked about it a little bit last week, but universities, they will be established. The skepticism, the thinking, the questioning of some of the teachings of the Roman Church. So in universities, you had people devoted to study, and of course they were trying to study like the idea of the fragility of life. The Black Plague had made people think about, the fragility of life. Just what is life, And Aristotle had an understanding that there was something bigger, but he really offered no hope. But this was being married, okay? This was being married. Okay, so the first great universities. Now, Italy is where the Roman Church was based, so this is where skepticism began. They were closest to the fire, let's say. They smelled the smoke, or they smelled the smell. They were maybe fire isn't quite the right word. Fire implies that there might be purity there, but they were closest to the garbage heap that was there. The Roman, So in Italy, that was Salerno is really the first great university, and it's still there in Salerno. It's one of the cities on the coast. It was actually one of the first cities that the Allied forces freed from the Axis power in World War II. Famous George W. Patton, I believe, was one of those who led this battle to free Salerno, Italy. I believe I could be corrected on that, but I think that was one of the battles in Italy that he managed to help take over. First in the Nazi era, they took back Africa, drove the Desert Fox Rommel to the continent, and then they began taking over Italy, drove Mussolini, killed himself, and then, but that's recent history. Sorry, old history. Want to go back to old history. Salerno, 1060 is the establishment of this university. And and this was, so they're closest to Rome. They're seeing these things happen, and they're beginning to study things. This was a medical and other things, but primarily a medical institution. Okay, so what's going on in the world? What's going on in the world here is, this trade is coming, and things are developing. Banking. Now, this is a picture of the way banking used to be done. Banking and commerce is developing. People are in universities. They're thinking about the freedom. They're growing freedom. You don't have to work the land. There's more children are not given, to work the land like they used to work, so they're going to go to university. The idea of university is springing up. This is one picture, and this is another picture of university. This is Oxford. Oxford University was the second university. This was established in England. Oxford was the second, and we just had a conference there. Pastor Schaller actually just did a conference in Oxford. So this was established in 1140. And both of these places are important. Both colleges, these colleges are important because, the minds began to explore the truth. They began to, contemplate and examine what was being said. Some other great universities would be Cambridge. That was another one in England. Cambridge. This was established in 1200. University of Paris. University of Paris. These things would become, all of these things, with the exception of Salerno, Oxford and Paris would produce some of our, and Prague, these first, 5 major universities that were developed in Europe, would produce important figures in the next stage of church history. 1348 is Prague. These are the establishment of these primary universities. Now, most of these were tied to the church, tied to the Roman Church. They were teaching. Most of the teachers were monks and or priests of some sort, and they were dedicated to teaching, and they were teaching the scriptures, so to speak, Latin, and then the classics also, the philosophy, Aristotle, and they're trying to meld their minds, their reasonable minds, the idea of human reason with the teachings that were coming from the pulpit, and they were finding this, somewhat difficult, to do, to put these things together, to put these things in their minds. Okay, but the thing that was happening because of, the not being tied to the land, they are having this growing sense of freedom, freedom of time, freedom of thought, and they, these things would, these things would lead to the energy that would be put into the Reformation that will come in the next few years, next few hundred years. The Reformation, the people would begin to demand. They would begin to have, so one, these universities meant that there was more teachers. Okay, and this was important. The university education has always been about making education. Okay, do you know that? Education is big business, When I went to Towson University, I graduated in 1982. 1982, I was graduate there, and it was a big scandal because the last year I was there, the tuition went up to $410 a semester. $410. 15 credits, full-time tuition. Now, I wasn't a live-on-campus student. I was a commuter. But $410, it was a big scandal. It had been under $300 for all those years, and now it was going over $400 a semester. So that was like really amazing. So now, all these years later, I think it costs about $6,000 or something to go. I think it costs at least something like that. I don't know, some ridiculous amount. I should know that, but having, anyway, but education, this education, okay. What was involved in this? There's 2 parts of education. There was trivium, trivium, and this was part of this was primarily their language skills, language and thinking skills. Now, this is what they're being taught, This is the way they're being taught. Why is this important? Because people would begin to gain a sense of logic, a sense of logic. That was one of the topics. Logic, which is really math, only done with concepts, If I drive 75 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone, and a policeman is watching, logic, what's the concept? I will get a ticket. And I will deserve it. I will have broken the rules. That's logic. It's math for concepts. 1 plus the 1 part of the occasion, 1, I'm driving 35 miles over the speed limit, plus 1, a policeman witnesses it, and then, pulls me over, equals, something. So that it's like conclusions, the idea of how are conclusions reached. So it's really a mathematical concept applied to philosophical principles. And this is also taken from these ancient Greek thinkers. They began to develop in thinking about geometry and all those things, they began to apply math principles. Like, why is 1, 1? Can you tell me that? Can anybody tell me why this, or, in Europe, this is the number 1, and this is the number 2? And then it means like this is 1, 2. And why is that 1? Do we know? Do we know that? Can we answer that question? Have we ever been able to answer that question? Like, because it just is, right? Because it just is. It's just one of those things that we have accepted as being real. Like, okay, so it's like the sky is blue, why is red, red? I understand that, but I mean, this is even, a color can have a name. I'm with you, Ray. A color can have a name, but 1 is 1. And, and Three Dog Night told us that 1 is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Just so you know, for all those who, don't Google Three Dog Night. It's not worth it. They only had and Jeremiah was a prophet, not a bulldog. Okay? All right, sorry. Anyway, all those who are over 50 or nearing 50, they know those songs, and they come back in their brain every now and then, and they go to they go to weddings, and they have to hear some of those songs played. But anyway, but why is 1, 1? But it just is. And then logic, the philosophy of logic, grew out of the idea of math, and math, the idea of geometry, algebra, those kind of things. A lot of that is like also coming from the culture of the East, of Islam. The idea of algebra and those things is really something that came out of Islam, and the abacus and those kind of counting things. So we have logic. Logic. This is the trivium. Trivium. It's not trivial. It's trivium. This is this part of your education. Excuse me. This part of your education, related to your communication skills, really. Logic, grammar, primarily Latin, as it related to Latin or Greek, whatever you were studying, and rhetoric. Okay? Now, rhetoric is important to understand that this is in. Why is rhetoric important? This is the art of argument. Okay? Argument. Rhetoric is the art of argument. And when Paul, that's the thing. Stephen, in the book of Acts, Stephen, gives an argument, and the argument stirs a reaction. It's the ladder of communication. Strong words, strong nouns, strong verbs form sentences. Those are the first 2 rungs of the ladder of communication, but eventually you put a couple words together, you have a sentence. A couple words together and a piece of punctuation, you have a sentence. If you put a few sentences that are related together, you have a paragraph. You put a few paragraphs together, you have a presentation. If your presentation is strong in terms of rhetoric, then your argument will be powerful and you will stir a reaction. And that's the point of rhetoric. That's also the rules for any kind of writing or anything like that, those 4 rules there. So we control the words, we control the sentences, we control the paragraphs, we control the order of presentation. And this is what they're learning in the university. They're learning this idea, this rhetoric, this idea of argument. And it's really amazing. There's a really amazing John Lennox, and there's a debate with one of the present atheists. I hate to call them great because they're fools. A fool has said there is no God. That's what it has. Did you hear that a judge did that in Virginia? It always happens in Virginia. Like a guy was sued and he said, we need a holiday for atheists, and the judge said, April 1st is already your holiday. And he said, why? Because a fool has said in his heart there is no God, so April Fool's Day is your holiday. There you go. How's that one? It's true. A judge did declare that. Somebody brought one of those frivolous lawsuits. He gave him $1 and said, you already have your own holiday. Yep, so there you go. But John Lennox, if you've listened to him, he's really awesome. He builds a boat and it holds water. That's it's a good argument. And when he debates these people, you can just see them wilt, because they talk about how if everyone was an atheist, the world would be so much better. And then he goes on. John Lennox will answer and just go on to talk about Chairman Mao and the great Cultural Revolution and Joseph Stalin and Lenin and all those things that happened in those communist countries that no longer exist, where they tried to establish atheism. So rhetoric was like an important element here, because what will come out of these universities will be people who know how to talk and speak and argue the points of truth. And they will begin to read the Bible, and they will begin to understand that the things that are being said by the church in Rome and the things that they're instituting cannot be backed up by the Scriptures. So logic and the grammar and the rhetoric work together. So this place of university, I know you can speak bad about universities, because today it's almost the reverse. They're just filing a bunch of mush into people's heads. Logic and rhetoric. Using logic and rhetoric, you can take apart the myth that is evolution very carefully. Very carefully. It's very easy. It's very simple. My wife has an uncle, and he's a doctor, and we had this. He heard that I'm a pastor, and he said, "Let me ask you something, Pastor." And so I knew, okay, here it comes. Let me ask you, what do you think about, how do you explain, the nature of life and evolution? I said, well, I really can't explain it all. I believe what the Bible says about the Creator. And he says, you believe that, why, that's logical to you? And I said, well, here, let's talk logic. It takes a great deal more faith to believe the way you believe. I said, because really, your evidence is shaky. I said, and if, you talk about, infinitely, I said, you talk about something happening at a period of time, a large explosion happening, and then all of this complexity coming from that large explosion. I said, I have witnessed many, many thunderstorms in Baltimore, and many, many lightning strikes have happened. And yet over all the junkyards of Baltimore, never has a Mercedes driven out the door after such a thunderstorm. And, and I'm saying I'm an infinitely more complex thing than a Mercedes-Benz. I said, if you break the windshield of a Mercedes-Benz, it doesn't feel it. But if you step on my little toe, I'm going to kick you. So I said, it takes a great deal more faith to believe that a bang at some point in history created all that I now live on, and even led to the creation of who I am. And I said, you got a great deal more faith. You take a greater leap of faith than I do. So that's a rhetorical, logical argument. Silence the guy. The good news is he's still alive. Maybe he's being witnessed to tonight at his birthday party by my saved mother-in-law. But, this is the way he was a doctor, a genius. But hey, anyway, nice guy. All right, so trivium, these liberal arts. So there were 7 of them. So this is trivium, and then there was another part, quad, for 4. There was another 4 parts, quadrivium. This is primarily, this is what the basic elements of university studies went through in these studies. So in this, arithmetic. They learned they learned this, music, because it soothes the savage beast, that kind of thing. Geometry, the shape of things, and astronomy, not astrology, astronomy. And this was, really, this is all of this is, really important. Arithmetic, these 2 things are really closely connected to the birth of commerce. Arithmetic, the bankers, you had to add, the debits and the credits and all those things. And astronomy, this is really important because the ships guided their courses by the stars. Where's the North Star? Where's the Big Dipper? Where's Orion? Where's Pleiades? They knew how to read the sky, and where those things were at different times of the year told them which way was north. And so this understanding of astronomy. So these things are, as they study astronomy, they understand the depth of the number of stars. The more telescopes that they build, the more number of stars that they can see, and they start to understand that the Bible is true, that the stars are without number. And so this combination, these are the seven liberal arts that the student was to master, during his time in university. So these universities like Cambridge, this is Oxford. This is a newer picture of Oxford. This is what it looks like now. It's still there. I've been teaching people 1,200, almost 800 years now. 800 some years they've been having classes at Oxford, 1140 to now almost 900 years, I guess. So 1140 is when it was established in England. So they're learning these elements, and the degree system. The degree system was established, and we still hold to it, really. The degree, 4 years, your study, you get your bachelor's. And this was all tied. What is being created is a class of communicators. Okay? Commerce is creating movement. Commerce is bringing people together in cities. The university is creating movement in the heart and the mind about what's going on, what's being said. They're reading things, they're thinking things, they're using their human reason, sometimes wrongfully, but sometimes rightly. And then, they are learning these things, bachelor's, and after you have a bachelor's degree, you are apt to teach, And then when you become a master, you can have your own class. All of these are related to becoming like a teacher. So you are a bachelor's, you can teach. You are a master, you can teach teachers. And then a doctor also teaches, a doctorate. This is the doctorate, a doctor's degree. These three levels of degrees, these have stayed with us. And these degrees were really, these were the things that, that they would bestow on these people. So these all led to these, this class. You have these young men, primarily men. I'm sorry to say, at that time it was really sort of only a man's domain at that point in time. But the teachers who knew logic, teachers who knew rhetoric, were being produced at all of these schools, with an understanding of the sky, with an understanding of the shape of things, with an understanding of music and what it does to a heart, with an understanding of how things are supposed to add up. And so this is all coming together. This is all coming together as the church at Rome is being exposed for what it really is, the wrongful holder of the title of Peter's rock. Peter is not the rock that the church was built upon. Peter's testimony that Jesus is the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, that is the rock of that verse. The rock that Jesus will build his church upon is that foundational truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, who would die for the sins of the world. That, the Son of the living God, that is the rock, that fact. And John says that later on, that anyone who denies that Jesus is the Christ is Antichrist, and anyone who denies that Jesus came in the flesh is Antichrist and should not be listened to, and introduces a spirit into the culture that shouldn't be there, into the culture of the church. So the teachers are listening, thinking, poetry, prose, discussion, composition, writing. Things are happening. People are understanding. More and more people outside of the church are learning about letters. And that will mean that the Word of God will be in people's hands in a short order. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. The Word of God will be in people's hands. Okay, so this idea of scholasticism, this is the word, maybe we said a little bit, let me spell it the right way. Scholasticism. This begins to, like the school, the students begin speaking upward. Okay, now the thing is, okay, we have to understand something. Okay, God allowed the Roman Church its measure of authority. Okay, let's say that. Okay, the measure of authority was used by God to establish these places where students could come. And what this produced in the students was this scholasticism, which is the students began to speak, they began to speak and, to the church, to this church. And there was a couple people, that began, there's a couple people who began to become famous at this time. They began to, let's see, how is it? They were trying to, the philosophy, the human reason, the logic that they were learning from studying the Greek classics was now being applied to the things that they were hearing from the priests, and they weren't adding up. And so this is the measure of scholasticism. This is the challenge to the church, challenge to church doctrine. Okay, the Roman church, I should say the Roman church. Challenge to Roman church doctrine, scholasticism. One group of people, was elevating humanity. That's Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. We know him. We heard of him. But before him, there was this man named Peter Abelard. Now, you know the story I'm going to tell? Oh, okay. Well, Peter Abelard. There's two men, Abelard and Anselm. Anselm is in England. Anselm is in England. Abelard is in Paris. Okay? So, this is the human reason. Human reason. This is what he bases his things on, bases his whole idea. A doctrine is not to be believed. This is what he says. A doctrine is not to be believed just because God said it, but because we are convinced by reason that it is so. Okay? So you understand that? A doctrine of God is not to be believed. This is Abelard. Okay? Is not to be believed by God just because God said it, but because we are convinced by reason that it is so. Now, Abelard is kind of interesting. Peter Abelard is kind of interesting. He had he had a student. He had a little female student that he was teaching, a tutor. He was tutoring a female student of one of the rich people in Paris. He fell in love with the student. Okay, fell in love with the student, had an affair with the student, married the student. Just one problem. The student's father and brothers were not happy about it. So one night while he was sleeping, they came in and made sure that he couldn't have relations with the girl anymore. So, yeah, they took care of him, And the thing that brought so much pleasure was, removed from my body. So, that happened to him. Human reason didn't get him very far there. You see that? Sin will find you out. It did. So that's just one background of that, one background story. But Anselm had a different kind of frame of reference. His idea was, I believe, and that is my order for understanding. So Anselm had a different idea. God said it, I believe it, that's the beginning of my understanding. And, so Anselm's kind of philosophy, really is the basis for our kind of Bible college philosophy. We believe the Bible, that's where we start. We believe God has said, and then we build our logic and our rhetoric based on what God has said. But both of these scholastics are speaking, one in Paris, one in Canterbury in England. One is speaking these things to the world, to a system, that has abused people. This will lead. This won't go away. Human reason won't go away. It will lead to the development of other philosophies, of worldly philosophy. But worldly ideas. But this will also remain. I believe. I believe. This idea, I believe, now I'm ready to learn. This one is, I can't believe until I have reasoned it out. This one is, I believe, now I can learn. And we know that this is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the beginning of wisdom, and we know that we can't really receive counsel from God until we have this wisdom in our heart. So this is the setting for what could best be called the Pre-Reformation era of the Pre-Reformation era of Europe, the Pre-Reformation era in Europe, and this is it is dominated by these thinkers, the letters, the teachers, the thinkers, and this collision between human reason and the fear of the Lord, believing these things are going to collide. And in the Reformation, men will go back to the book. Men will be reading the book and go back to what the book says and begin to rebuild, the church. So skepticism, rationalism, human reason, these things all begin to come out of this. Now, let's read one verse before we take a break here. A couple of verses. This is best defined in James, particularly this guy. This guy's thing is best defined, both of them actually here. James 3:15. This wisdom descends not from above, but is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Those are the things. The worldly thing, the flesh, and the devil. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, and then is peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So that's James. So we see this is the element, James 3:15 to 18. This is where we base it. So this is solidly in this place. This shows the war that's going on. Sensual, earthly, devilish wisdom is beginning to permeate a certain part of society. But on the other hand, there are men and women of God who are holding fast to the truth. Okay. All right, let's take a break, and we'll come back. And let's 10 minutes, be back quarter after. Okay? Thank you.